So my name's Patrick, but I ask people to call me Pat because research suggests that you will like me more if you do. So hopefully that's working. But in this study, they found that if you use a shorter name, a nickname, you're seen as more popular, more cheerful, things I think I could use help with. And that's the kind of stuff I do, is take consumer psychology, this kind of scientific, academic side of psychology, and help businesses and brands actually practically apply it, which I'll talk about today. But also, if you use your given name, the longer name, you're also seen as more moral. So maybe I should have used that, because I used to work at Cambridge Analytica. So I will let you have a controlled booing now if you want to. Yeah, thanks. So for those who don't know, what we did was understand audiences on a psychological level, so in terms of personality and motivation and values and things, and then customize messages based on that. So for example, if your audience is extroverted, then you should use advertising which is social and shows lots of people and people having fun. Whereas if they're more introverted, maybe you show someone by themselves with more muted colors and design. But this same kind of reasoning can be used for UX and design as well, which I'll talk about today. So I'm not all bad. I've also done some other stuff. I have a book which you can buy on Amazon now. If you like it, please leave a review. If you didn't like it, please don't. But as well as kind of plugging it, I wanted to ask if any of you know why I put a pug on the front. It was sell more. Do you know why? It's cute, yeah. So it uses what's known as baby schema. So because it has characteristics of a baby, so big eyes, kind of vulnerable and soft to the touch, and small, we will instantly pay attention to it, because if we didn't do that, then evolutionary speaking, our babies might have been eaten by dingoes and we wouldn't be here today. I'm also, to give you some context, part-time lecturer, and I've worked with brands on this kind of stuff, applying psychology. I'm just using something called social proof here, so if they're doing it, I must be good. From a digital perspective, one of those pieces of work was for eBay, looking at the effect of background noises on online shopping. So if you're shopping online, try not to listen to classical music, because you'll be more likely to buy products, because you'll be primed to see them as higher quality, because we associate classical music with quality and sophistication. Likewise, I found that if you play birds singing, the noise of birds singing, then people are more likely to buy barbecue, because it primes those ideas of being outside. So these are the types of nudges and cues which will influence your user's behavior. And this goes to the fact that, just generally speaking, we're very much influenced by cues and processes that we have very little awareness of and very little control of as well. And a great example of this was this study where participants were brought into a room and told, okay, please just wait here before the experiment begins, and the researcher will come and meet you. But what they didn't know was that this was the experiment, and they were being secretly filmed. And what they found was, after they shook the researcher's hand, they would surreptitiously scratch their nose or touch their face because they were smelling their hand. Because when you shake someone's hand, that communicates, or you pick up pheromones and hormones and chemicals and things from that person's hand and their sweat, and you'll subconsciously sniff it to get insights into that person. So people, generally speaking, are unaware of this, but you'll probably be aware of it now in the coffee break, so you're welcome. And this is because the emotional, kind of subconscious, irrational brain is more influential, because it's been around for longer and it's ensured our survival for longer. So there's a theory known as the Triune Brain theory. It's a bit simplified and outdated, but it generally holds up. That there are 3 parts to the brain, and each part has a different region, and these evolved and developed over time. So the oldest part is the reptilian brain, which is responsible for instinct and the senses and body temperature and things like that. Then you have the mammalian brain, responsible for things like emotion. And finally, you have the human cerebral cortex around the outside, responsible for things like planning and thinking ahead and language. So generally, these are split into like the old brain, system 1, emotional, intuitive, quick, and the new brain, system 2, which is slow, logical, rational. So most people know that. But what most people might not be aware of is the split between the two. So You can't really put a number on it, but people have tried, and let's try here. If you think about everything the brain does, let's say in a second, all the kind of bits that run through the brain, how much of it do you think is conscious versus non-conscious? So let's see, who would think it's 100% conscious? Who would say it's more than 50% conscious? 50-50? Okay, so who would say it's less than 50% conscious? And then keep your hand up if you'd say less than 20%, less than 10%, less than 1%. So we used to kind of think that the conscious brain was like the Oval Office in the White House making all the decisions, but more recently it's more likely that the emotional brain is the Oval Office and the conscious brain is more like the press office, trying to explain and justify things after the fact rather than making the decisions. Or another useful analogy is Kirk and Spock. So Kirk is very emotional and hot-headed, intuitive, he does things quickly. Spock is logical and rational. But just remember who the captain is, who's steering the ship. So the takeaway is that emotion tends to dominate over reason. And I'll give you an example. Hopefully it wasn't just me, but when you were a kid, did you ever hear that if you kept your eyes open while you sneezed, your eyeballs would pop out? Did anyone hear that? Did anyone try and do it? Right. And you can't do it. You can't logically stop that from happening. You can't rationally concentrate and stop your heart from beating. If you see an optical illusion, you can't unsee it, even though rationally you know the two lines are the same length, you still can't unsee the illusion. So our emotional kind of subconscious brain tends to win out when it comes into conflict with the rational brain. And I think an important point to make is that this still very much holds true even today, even when we have very sophisticated technology. We're still driven by biases and emotion. So look at the internet, right? This amazing, amazing tool. All of the information in the world we have to hand. We use it for pornography, cat videos, and getting in arguments with strangers. So even though the technology is sophisticated, the use of it is still driven by emotion and by biases. This is encapsulated nicely by the quote that our modern skulls house a Stone Age brain. So as advanced and as wonderful as the technology is, it's still essentially monkeys using it. So one of these biases then is personalization. So as I'm sure all of you are well aware, that personalization works. So for example, in this study, they crafted messages to suit different personality types. And they asked people how persuasive do you find the messages. And so extroverts were persuaded or reported to be more persuaded by a phone advert which says, we talked about excitement and having fun and going to parties, whereas agreeable, friendly, trusting, warm people, it was more about using the phone to let people know that you care. So if you're tapping into those psychographics between groups, then the messages are more effective. And there's three reasons, I think, why this is. So first of all, we pay attention to personal stuff. Secondly, personal things are more likable and therefore more persuasive. And thirdly, personalized messages just resonate with us on a neurological level, which I'll explain. So first of all, though, personal things catch attention. I'm going to do a small experiment with you. I'm going to show you 8 images on screen, and they'll be up very quickly, so pay attention. And we'll just see which ones you noticed or remembered. Okay, now I'm going to show you 3 images. 2 of them were up there, and I've just thrown 1 in the mix. That's new. So, did anyone see a boat? Okay, a couple of people. Did anyone see a spider? Right, lots of people. And did anyone see a house? Okay, so the boat was up there. A few people saw that. The spider obviously was definitely up there, and the house wasn't. So on the tangent, what's interesting is that some people say they saw the house even though it wasn't there, so there's some kind of post-rationalization going on. But the most important thing is that most people saw the spider because, again, there's an evolutionary instinct to instantly pay attention to these kind of things, just like we pay attention to babies or puppies. We'll pay attention to anything that's threatening. So if you're ever on the tube and someone gets on with a puppy or a baby, just watch what everyone else does. They'll just stare transfixed at it. And this is because there's only a very limited amount of the world that we can pay attention to. We just can't process everything. So one estimate, and it is an estimate, but an estimate was that we can only consciously pay attention to 0.0004% of everything that goes through our brain from a sensory point of view. And there's a network of regions in the brain which acts as kind of like a bouncer or a gatekeeper, and it filters everything at a low level and then says, this is important, you need to pay attention to this consciously. So it has kind of a VIP list. So imagine that you are at a crowded cocktail party, and it's very noisy, and people are clinking drinks and talking, and there's music, and your name's Bob, and you hear someone across the room say, I don't really care for Bob. You will have heard that, even though you weren't paying attention to that person. Your brain will say, this is important, you need to pay attention to that because it's your name. And also what's interesting is you heard the whole sentence, even though your name was at the end. So your brain was processing everything that it's hearing and feeling and seeing at a low level, and then directing your limited conscious attention to what it deems to be important. So it has kind of a VIP list of things we'll pay attention to. So food, faces, sex, anything surprising or weird, movement, things like this, but also personal things we'll pay attention to. So in this study, participants were asked to browse a website, and there was some adverts in there. And for some of them, they personalized the advert to have a picture of the participant in it. Probably not something you could do, certainly not anymore. But the principle stands the same, that if you personalize, okay, not with their face, but maybe their interests, or if you speak in the language that they use words that they used to, maybe dialect for that particular part of the country, you'll grab their attention. So as you can probably imagine, this personalized ad with the user's face got a lot more attention as measured through eye tracking. The second reason is persuasion. So we're more amenable to and more likely to be persuaded by something that's personal to us because we like things that are attractive and familiar, but also similar. So there's a lot of information out there in the world. There's something in psychology called Dunbar's number, which holds that we can only really have about 150 friends because our brain's just not big enough to have more friends than that. But obviously online, you can have hundreds of friends on a single social medium. So how do we pay attention to, or how do we process all of this information when our brains just weren't built to handle it? When we are what's known as cognitive misers, we have limited attention spans, limited energy, basically. Well, let me ask you a question. Let's say you're out on a business trip in a foreign city that you've never been to before, and you're hungry and you're going out for dinner, and you find two restaurants, these two. Who would rather eat at this one? Why?
More popular?
Yeah, it's busy. So if everyone goes there, it must be good. It's a heuristic, a bias, a shortcut. You don't have to taste the food, you don't have to look up reviews online, you don't have to talk to people about it, you don't have to check the hygiene certificate. You just know everyone goes there, so it must be good. That is what a heuristic is, a kind of shortcut that allows us to make decisions and navigate the world on autopilot. And liking is one of these shortcuts. So we're more persuaded by people or brands or websites that we like. Give you an example from psychology research. It was in the 70s, as you'll probably be able to tell, but they had someone dressed either in a suit or as a hippie, and they went around asking for money to use a phone box. And they found that people in suits were more likely to give money to the person when they're wearing a suit, and vice versa, so that hippies give money to hippies. Because we like and are persuaded by people who are similar to us. So personalization works in that sense. And then the third reason I want to talk about is resonance. So if you're using certain aesthetics and words and psychological nudges, they're just going to tap into essentially the way that people's brains are structured. Much more effectively. So for example, people who are open to experience, that is kind of creative and liberal with a small L and adventurous and emotionally sensitive, they, or in tune with their emotions, they are more likely to listen to jazz and classical music and certain complex types of heavy metal because that music has complex patterns in which their brain basically responds much better to. Or if you're an extrovert, you're more likely to listen to dance music or pop music because it gives you that sensation and stimulation that your brain needs. So essentially there are broadly speaking, 5 personality traits which define your kind of psychological makeup. And then these traits are largely the result of kind of genetic, hardwired factors, kind of brain structure kind of stuff. But what's important is they result in behaviors, so outward behaviors that you can observe, and then you can use those outward, immediate, observable behaviors to predict long-term patterns in their behavior. So for example, if somebody is extroverted, that's at least partly because they have more volume in the region of the brain that's associated with processing reward information, so they're more reward focused. And extroverts are happier, they're more outgoing, they like sensation and excitement, they like crowds and so on. And that results in these observable behaviors. So extroverts are more likely to wear faded old shoes, I guess because they're more active. They smile more often because they're positive and reward focused. And they listen to pop music or dance music because they need that stimulation. So you can use these kind of cues to understand, is this person extroverted or not? And then you can use that insight to predict their behavior and look at kind of designing things in a way which will be most effective for them. So let's say you want to advertise a job website to extroverts, you should probably focus it on kind of salesy, people-focused jobs. If that person has bought shoes on Amazon, or I don't know, exercise shoes on Amazon, if they're smiling in their profile picture, and if their Spotify has lots of pop music on, you can say they're probably an extrovert, and so we'll advertise this kind of job to them. So some of these things that you can customize to traits, aesthetic preferences. So this is some research I did for a website that sells art, finding statistically significant correlations between art people said they like and their personality traits. So open people just like jazz and classical music. They like kind of complex, thoughtful, reflective art. Conscientious, kind of organized people, they like structured, simple art. Extroverts like sensational, exciting art. Disagreeable people like kind of morbid or sometimes even violent art. And neurotic people like kind of dark, somber art. So you can think about how the aesthetics of a website could be customized based on that. Similarly, emojis, for example, disagreeable people are more likely to like the shark emoji or the devil emoji. So you could think about how to talk to people using emojis based on this kind of psychographics. And language as well. So for example, neurotic people are more emotional in their speech. They use more negations, like the word no. They talk about themselves more. And so if you know someone's neurotic, then the copy that you have on your website or wherever could be targeted to that personality trait. And finally, also different personality traits respond to nudges differentially. So neurotic people they're less stable, so they're more kind of swayed by the environment. So if a product already has a high 5-star rating, neurotic people will give it a higher rating, and if it's a low rating, they'll give it a lower rating. In other words, they're more influenced by what already sits there as kind of a social proof cue. But there's a whole load of research on how personality and influence are linked, and you can use different nudges depending on personality traits. And finally, some research I did, I won't go into detail, but I asked a bunch of people all sorts of questions about colors, wording, art that they like, films that they like, their personality traits, and found there are 3 kind of communication types. You have indulgent, which is kind of social and fun, sensation-seeking, which is a bit rebellious and dangerous, and thoughtful, which is kind of reflective. So you can see how this could be applied to designing platforms for users. So how do you use it? Well, the first thing to note is that everybody does this. We perceive traits, and then we behave differently based on that, so face-to-face. So you would treat someone differently if they're wearing a military uniform than you would if they were, I don't know, not wearing anything. You can probably gauge different personality types. So let me give you an example of how intuitively this is done. What type of person would you say lives in this bedroom? Extrovert, teenager, yeah. Probably maybe a little creative, but outgoing, not very organized. And in this bedroom? More organized, more neurotic maybe. So if I was to tell you that one of these is my bedroom, which one do you think it is? Who would say this one? Who would say the other one? Okay, well actually it's neither, but it's good to know what you think of me, thanks. And this comes down to something in psychology called thin slices. So if I was to give you a very small slice of a cake, you could look at that and you could very accurately tell me what the rest of the cake looks like. In the same way, if you have a very small slice of a person's behavior, you can look at it and tell what the rest of their behavior is like. You can look at a Facebook profile and tell what type of job they'll succeed in. So what we're doing here is nothing really that unethical or creepy. It's just doing what humans do naturally and scaling it online. For an example of thin slices, a counselor videotaped newlyweds, coded their behavior for certain things like contempt and stonewalling, and he was able to predict whether or not they'd get divorced within a few years to 83% based on this 15-minute video. So that's an example of a thin slice. Just one very short slice of behavior can predict something quite accurately. So just a couple of cool examples of behaviors and thin slices. If you are disagreeable, you're more likely to like bitter foods like dark chocolate and gin, whereas agreeable people like sweeter foods. Cat people, on average, tend to be more creative and neurotic, whereas dog people tend to be more extroverted and agreeable. Also, some other research found that cat people vote liberal, dog people vote conservative. On average, obviously. And then some research into sex found that agreeable people are more likely to say yes to an orgy. I guess they agree to everything. And conscientious people are more likely to say no. I guess they don't like the lack of structure. I wouldn't know. And then, of course, there are digital cues that you can use as thin slices. So what type of person do you think, you can't do this with Facebook anymore, but what type of person do you think likes anime in the West? So it was introverted people, and they found that Addams Family, liked by neurotic people, and a whole bunch of other cues like this that you can use to infer personality. By the way, everyone's doing this. The Obama campaign did it back in 2012. The Guardian and Channel 4 do similar things. This was in 2015. Spotify was using your playlist to kind of gauge what mood you're in and to personalize ads based on that. And that was almost 4 years ago. And so what's next, I would imagine, is a more passive kind of measurement of these things, so rather than having to ask people. So, for example, through biometrics. So this was a study I did at a company called CrowdEmotion, where you measure people's emotional responses to music through their facial expressions, and then you can predict what kind of things they like and what kind of people they are. And Apple measures facial expressions in their latest phone, so this stuff is not really that far away. And we're likely headed towards this kind of era of Uber personalization based on psychology, both states, so your mood in that current moment, and traits, which are long-term characteristics and the interaction between the two. That's it, thank you.